All right, let's kick this off then. So, AutoCache and Sitecore. Today we will be talking what is it and how to implement it, and hope and hope and hopefully we can. This will make sense. The benefits where you can use it with frameworks like BrainDrop Score or any others out there in the market. So yeah, let's kick this off then. So first of all, something a little bit about me. My name is Diego Moretto. I'm one of the Sitecore user groups organizers here in Brazil. That is my Twitter account, and also I am a senior Sitecore team lead at BrainJox. And for the last 3 years, I've been nominated with the Sitecore Technology MVP Award. So yeah, enough about introductions. So why AutoCache? First of all, let's talk about why do you cache your components? So this is not new in Sitecore, right? So when you're building your components on your pages, you pretty much get, since I think version 6-ish on Sitecore, you can already start, can add cache variations to any component on a page. This is not new, right? So the first thing that when you're building a website, it's good practice to think about your cache strategy. And I'm talking about HTML cache here, by the way. Like for strategy, not just HTML, but I mean, this presentation is mostly about that. But let's just say, do you want to cache all your components? Do you want to cache specific types of components? What are the cache variations that you're going to get? Are they going to vary by data source? They're going to vary by user? They're going to vary by page? All of that you have to think about what you're going to deliver, because Sitecore already delivers that for you out of the box. So that's the first reason. The second one is you want to reduce your processing as much as possible when you're building something, right? You gotta perform well. And Sitecore already gives you that, so why not benefit from it? And of course, by reducing your processing, you get to improve your performance, which is actually something very useful. So, for example, when you're building, when you're analyzing a website and you want to deliver specific metrics on SEO, on page load, on, you got to think about that. Are you going to have CDN to cache your static assets, your images? Do you want to process your component every single time when your page loads, on your home page? Are there any custom integrations there that you need that content to be dynamically generated every single time, or is that something that doesn't change much and you can cache it? So, I mean, really what you want to look for is, if things don't change, you want to cache it, and improve your performance. And of course, as I said, you want to specify what types of variations you want based on the scenarios, right? So, yeah. Now, why AutoCache? AutoCache is something that is not supported by Sitecore out of the box. So let me give you a little bit of perspective where we came up with this idea. The first thing is atomic design. So atomic design is something that we use a lot in BrainDrop Score, and there are other accelerators out there that follow this approach of componentizing features as much as possible and enabling content authors to pretty much pick how they want to assemble their pages. So atomic design really is that discipline of enabling content authors to assemble the data however they want. Even the data may not change, but maybe the presentation may change. So you want to give them that granularity of saying, this breadcrumb or this image or this button here is going to work like I'm going to put it on this section of the page, but on the other I want to put on the other section of the page, completely different, and you want to maybe even have them look differently, but it's still the same data. So atomic design really enables you to do that. And I guess here is probably the biggest reason why you want to auto-cache. Standard values may not cover 100% of your scenarios with atomic design. Let me give you one example. Let's just say that you have a very small website, and this website has 5 different templates, content templates, right? So when you're building those, and you have like a design that doesn't change much, you can pretty much specify all your cache variations in standard values, right? You can say, this header here, or this banner is gonna vary by data. So anytime the component changes, you want to get that, bam, it works fine. But if you have a more complex scenario where, for example, you have a design where you can have 1,000 different variations on your pages, how you address that without creating every single template for every single type of page? And to add to that, how do you give the flexibility for content authors to pretty much assemble the content the way they want without creating a rigid structure that they have to use a specific template to follow that design, right? So we've seen scenarios like this where customers of ours, they wanted as much flexibility as possible for the content authors. They didn't want, any sets of pre-built templates. Of course, we had some, but those would not cover all of their design variations. So we had to think of how we would deliver that to them. Like, how can we deliver that they fulfill? They can build all the pages that they need based on the design, but they can still need to benefit from it, right? So, and here's another interesting caveat for that. Content authors, in my personal opinion, they should not be picking cache strategies on their website. I mean, normal content authors, their skill set is really driven towards building content, is really driven towards assembling content, but selecting what's the type of cache that a component's going to have or a page is going to have really it creates complexity for them that normally is not their type of skill sets. So normally to dictate that, we pull in a developer and they're going to create a page based on that. So just to reiterate that, content authors shouldn't be making decisions whether we should be caching by data or by page. Another thing is, let's just say that there's a scenario where you also want to have different cache strategies per tenant. So different tenants of your website, different subsections of your website, you want to have different cache strategies. You can get that. So AutoCache actually helps you a lot with that. So just to reiterate, the benefit of AutoCache is you want to benefit from cache, but you also want to give content author flexibility. That's really why what AutoCache enables you, right? So when you're thinking about an AutoCache approach, here's a few things that you want to think about. The first one is, of course, HTML cache is applied automatically for all pages, right? So, or at least for the sections that make sense to be cached, right? So if this whole page, makes sense to cache, so you want to create a strategy that actually gives you that. The second one is each tenant could have different cache settings and variations. Say that you have specific cache strategies for one type of component for one site, and for the other site on the same Sitecore instance, you want to have a different one. So when you're thinking about AutoCache, you might want to think about that as well. The third one is you actually have to think about an opt-out scenario when conditions apply. So if there are, for example, if you have like a grid with 2 columns, and within one of those columns you have a button and an image and maybe a component that actually cannot be cached because of maybe, I don't know, it's integrating with a third-party system, and that section cannot be cached at all. It needs to be done every single time. So you need to opt out. So you need to create something that actually enables you to opt out. And also, not all rendering should have cache, just like I said. So you need really a way to set which ones should and which ones should not have auto cache. So again, an opt-out, right? And of course, you cannot break Sitecore functionality when you're building something like this. You cannot break personalization. You cannot break multivariant tests. So when you're thinking about that, you have to consider these two things here as well. So what I will be showing you guys in the next few slides is an idea, an implementation is not the implementation. There's multiple ways where one can achieve that. It really comes down to how deep you want to go with this, right? So if you want to have donut cache or just an opt-out, or really, I guess the point of this presentation is to show if you face a scenario like this, here's one way or way you can do it. It works. It's been tested and works perfectly. Now, of course, if you want to enhance it, it's up to you. So, but before we actually get to that, let's talk and cover a little bit about this rendering, this pipeline, which is actually very key for what you're doing. So, the MVC rendering pipeline is actually a pipeline that gets executed every single time when the rendering is rendered. So, if you have 10 renderings on your page, it will execute this pipeline 10 times. So for each component, for each rendering on your page, that this pipeline gets executed. Now, what that tells you is also is if you're enhancing it, you got to be careful, because any change that you make to this pipeline cannot slow Sitecore down at all. So it needs to be very precise changes. You want to make sure that you're not creating unnecessary slowness or anything like that. So even maybe adding logging can be a problem. I've seen that, like when you have like a very big load of data coming to a website and you're just adding logs and logs, every single time, it can flood your logs and it can create hardware problems. Actually can. So we tested that. So just so we kind of get a sense on how sensitive this pipeline is in that sense. So the first one, that there are three processors that I want to cover here before we actually get to the implementation. The first one is the set cacheability processor. What does this processor do? And I will show you. I have it decompiled here. It's going to be set cacheability. So hopefully you guys can see it well. Yeah, you should be seeing here. So this pipeline, this processor, again, this is coming from Sitecore, so it's the compiled code from Sitecore. So what does this processor do? It does something very important. It sets on the rendering arguments of this pipeline, which is actually passed along to every single processor, whether a rendering is cacheable or not. So when the content author logs into Sitecore, goes into the page, and actually sets this page is cacheable, you know that checkbox in rendering parameters? It's cacheable with vary by data. Let me just show you what I'm talking about real quick. So if I go here, while Sitecore is loading here, let me go back here. So when you're setting the vary by data and in cacheable, really, this is what this process is going to set. Whether it is cacheable or not, then this is cacheable really is the execution of these two methods down here. So, of course, there are its conditions, but really, if you want to hook into that pipeline, here's something that you need to watch out for. You want to set your renderings to cacheable. The second rendering, actually, I'm not going to show that because that's going to take too much time. So the second rendering is generate cache key. Also, out of the box Sitecore, what does this render this processor does? Again, this is just to level set and just to recap a few things. This will generate a cache key, which is a string, with the variation of the rendering. So for example, as I said, a banner that has vary by data set on it, here this processor, when it's executing, will generate the cache key based on that variation. So if you guys look here in the vary by data, it's actually going to append that part based on that variation. So it's going to do that for every single variation. So when you're executing a pipeline, there's a processor called render from cache, which we're going to see in a second, which actually is going to check whether there is something with that cache key. And if there is, that means that rendering hasn't already been cached. So this is something that you also need to think about, because we'll see in a second why this is important. And by the way, If you don't think about that, you will find yourself in a scenario where you can have, say, 2 column equal with, I don't know, one has a banner within it and the other one has like 2 instances of the same rendering, right? The other one has like a button. If you don't have cache variations, cache keys, what will happen is Sitecore will rendering the first, and when it's executing the second, if you don't have a variation, it's gonna just show the one that is already being cached. So it's a way for you to have multiple renderings in the same page, but they can vary. So you're not repeating, you're not creating a bug inside core really. So that's what this processor does. And last but not least, another one very important is render from cache. Render for cache is here. This processor, as I said, is what this is where it's gonna either execute or it's gonna render from cache, right? So the conditions here in this case is if there's a cache key, right? Or if it's already being rendered. So here, this render method, if you guys look here, it's gonna have check whether it's something in the HTML cache. It's already been executed once, so it's gonna cache it. If there is, it renders that HTML by executing this. So it's gonna write the HTML from the cache instead of actually executing the rendering itself. So that's how Sitecore caches your HTML under the hood. Okay, that was just to level set. Now let's talk about the actual implementation. First of all, what you need here, this is a custom config, by the way. You want to have a few things I want to point out here. The first one is you want to have tenant multi-tenancy. So you can see here that we have actually 2 different sites. One is tenant 1, tenant 2. Each of those, you want to have sections where you can include or exclude your renderings. So here, for example, here are all the lists, like the list of renderings that you want to include in your cache, and the ones that you want to exclude. And the same for tenant 2. So you can support multi-tenancy really easily by doing this. Now, no, this is some. Sorry, is building. If this is a module, this is something actually built. But yeah, we can cover here so later. So this is actually a class that pretty much reads that XML that we just saw. So get the included rendering section. So it's gonna read not just the rendering itself, the ID of it, and that's actually the Sitecore rendering ID of the rendering. And you can have each variation, right? So if we go into the cache settings config, which is just like an example of what I was showing you. Here you can have all the variations that you need, vary by data, vary by device, by login, pretty much. We also have vary by page. This is something customly built inside BrainJox Core. So we can have custom cache keys built in, so you can pretty much benefit from that. So you want to have a class that pretty much reads this configuration, right? So that's what this class is doing. So it's gonna, read that section. You're gonna have the one that actually the exclude section, pretty much the same, right? The second part to this is let's implement opt-in and opt-out. So to implement opt-in and opt-out, you need to remember when I showed you set cacheability processor, where you set arguments.cacheable equals true. We want to do the same thing for the renderings that live within this XML here. Let's just say these are all the renderings that we want to be auto caching. So page columns, these are all pretty much BrainJox Core grid components. So 1 column, 2 column, and all its variations. So we have snippets, we have picture stripes, pretty much all the components that we needed for this specific test site. So you want to actually implement a processor that helps you with that. So this is the processor, and I'm going to show you the implementation of it. It's actually a fairly simple processor. All that this processor does, and that's the method that really matters here, this apply cache, is you want to read that rendering, that XML, right, based on your site. So if you're on tenant 1, you're going to get all the renderings for tenant 1. That's what you want, because you want to support multi-tenancy, right? And once you have that list of IDs, this method does parse those to IDs, like pipe-based. You want to check whether the custom rendering, the rendering that is running, is actually within that list or not. So remember, this processor is going to get executed every time the pipeline, every time for each rendering on a page. So 10 renderings, 10 times. So it will know that, oh, this is the rendering for a banner. Oh, this is the rendering for a button. This is the render. It's going to get executed. So what you want to do is, if the rendering is within that list, you just pretty much set this property here. Rendering, caching, cacheable. It's not our args.cacheable, it's rendering cacheable, because here you can actually set the variations. So you need to do that. Also, if you want to support custom cache key, as I said, vary by page is something that we built for BrainJox Score. You can set it pretty much by setting the property, the parameters object property by setting, 1 or 0 based on whether it's set or not. So that when this process is executed, you're gonna set yes, this is cacheable, and yes, these are all the variations of it. Now let's go to the next one. Custom extend cache key with rendering unique ID. Yeah, the name is long. I get it. But this processor here, so there are 2 things you need to consider. You need to consider auto cache key for components with data sources and components without data sources. BrainJox Scores already gives you a processor that takes care of renderings with data sources. So we didn't have to worry about that. The framework would generate the cache key variations for us. But we did have to actually implement a variation for components without data sources, right? So for example, page 1 column, page 2 columns, these type of components, even though they don't have a data source and vary by data may not mean, but they may have different variations. So you need to have account for that. You need to make sure that if you have 2 on the same page, they cannot be duplicated. They need to have cache key variations. So this is how you do it. When you executing this processor, you want to, of course, check these conditions, whether whether this is not cacheable. Of course, if it's not cacheable, then it's not going to use it. But if it is, it's going to try to do that, which is pretty much set the cache key based on the rendering unique ID, right? This will generate the cache keys that we need. And also, actually, this is the second scenario that we had to take care of for components without data sources, which is when you have 2 components that share the same data source. You can have that scenario. Sitecore enables you to do that. So when we found the scenario, we had to add this extra check just so we can generate a cache key based on whether this existed or not on the cache key itself. Moving on. Third one, you need to apply a cache token. So we're still, up to this moment, we're only talking about opting in into AutoCache. Now we need to find a way to opt out. So an opt-out implementation that we thought was apply a cache token. So a token, think about this as maybe like an HTML comment. You need to differentiate your rendering and add something to it to say, hey, when this guy is like a flag, like a token, right? When this rendering is executed and it's found within the ones that you want to exclude, you need to mark it as excludable or add this token or however you want to call it. But you need to find a way to opt out, right? So one of the things that we did is we created this cache token class. So we execute this cache token class, and I'm going to show you one moment when this guy exists within the ones that are to be excluded. So again, exclude, you want to exclude, you want to add that token. And that token, what it does is actually very simple. Let me show you. Do I have that guy open? cache token. Now it's a perfect moment for Visual Studio to freeze. Well, that's Visual Studio 2017. Well, isn't that nice? So while we wait, let's look at this code here on line 52. So line 52, we're doing three things at once. The first one is we're checking whether the idea of the current rendering is part of the ones that get to be excluded, right? Let me just see if I can go to, okay, I'll get back to that in a moment. So this cache token, look at what it's doing. We're creating a string and we're adding an HTML comment to it, right? Why do we want to do that? Because when we are changing the HTML that is cached or that you want to remove, you're actually changing the HTML of it. So when you're adding this token, you're actually changing the component that the user is going to see. So if you look at the view source in the browser, you're going to see that. So you don't want to add like a label that the user can see. Of course, at the end of the pipeline, if you want to remove that, you can. But I'm just going to tell you that we're using this approach because then we're sure that no one will see. It's just going to be, on the view source. So yeah, so it's a way for you to opt out, and we'll see how we opt out in a moment. Going back, I was just showing you guys one thing. This line here is actually key. So we're just going to apply this exclude token in three scenarios. One, when you're on the list of the renderings to be excluded. Two, look at what we have here. When you have a property rendering XML and it contains a rule, that's how Sitecore, when it's building the layout, the delta, like all the, the share layout, the final layout, and all that is at the end of the day is an XML. And personalization, when you add personalization to a rendering, you're actually going to find something like this, like a rule within it, because a personalization is at the end of the day a rule, right? So if you find that, that means that this rendering has personalization within it. And also in the same property, if you find this MVT equals, that means that there's a multivariate test running on that. So you want to exclude if that's the case. And I'll actually open for discussion later as to whether you want to exclude or maybe you want to cache the variations. I guess it's up to you. But I mean, in this case, we're just opting out. And finally, render from cache. So what we're going to do in this case, we're going to replace Sitecore's processor. So all of those, the three processors that I just showed you, you're going to patch into the MVC rendering pipeline. You're going to add to that. But this one is you're going to patch instead. So we're going to remove Sitecore's rendering from cache, and you want to extend that. And it's actually very similar to what Sitecore processor does, but we're doing two different things here. So the first one is, look at what we're doing. So when we're executing the render, from the cache key, the render method with all these arguments, one of the things that we're checking here is, hey, whether it contains that token. If it contains that token, what we're doing, we're just returning false. Returning false in this processor means we're telling Sitecore execute it. If we don't return that to false, what we're going to do is we're going to write from the actual cache. So we're writing. This is this is where we're writing the actual what the user is going to see. So you either execute or you opt out. So this is how you opt out essentially. I mean, it's a very simple thing to do. Yeah. So, all right, it's demo time. Let's see if all of this works. And by the way, if you're wondering whether you have the source code of that or not, at the end of the presentation, there's a link with a blog post that I wrote about it. And this code that you guys are seeing here, pretty much it's all there. So the first thing, let me see if my session is still up. Yes, it is. Let me show you guys one thing, just to show that I'm. Look at what we have in the stats page. In the stats page of Sitecore, we have a few sites here. Only the Spanish version of the site actually have cache set up. You know, when you execute something on your website, the stats are gonna get data. So the stats page is actually comes with Sitecore 9, I guess 8 as well. But so you here you can pretty much tell, you know, for each site, you know, whether it's been executed, how many times that rendering was executed, if it was executed from cache, average time. This is a very useful tool if you want to profile something like that. So you can see here that the English side in UK is not here, US side is not here, and I'll show you why. Because now I'm gonna actually open that. So here is my test site that we built for our customers. So let me open the ENGB site for them. First time that we're executing it. It's gonna take a while because, of course, when you're building something like this, one thing that you also have to consider is you want to warm up your site when you're deploying these kind of things, because HTML cache, the first time you load your pages, you're not going to get cached, only on the second time. So you need to warm up. You need to think about which pages of your website are key that you need to pretty much account for that. So I left this like this on purpose because it's going to take some time. And then I'll refresh this page and we're going to see that stats page starting to pretty much fill that data. And if you're curious why we're waiting for this, one of the things that I'm not going to debug here, but if I add these breakpoints here and if I attach to the processor, all of these processes are pretty much going to get executed, and for every single rendering. So that page, I think it has like 30, 35 renderings. So it's going to execute this 35 times. So again, when you're doing something like that, just account for that. You don't want to add extra logic that you don't need, any heavy calls. Otherwise, this is going to blow up your performance. Okay. Okay, let's take a break. Yeah. Well, actually, it's already starting to execute. So let me show you what we're seeing here. So all of these renderings, you can see here that all of them, none of them are actually coming from cache because they're getting executed one by one. You can see here this column from cache. Now, whenever I refresh that page, we're gonna start seeing things show up in this column. So hopefully, come on, Sitecore. Let me. All right, it's gonna finally finish. Yeah, this is a little bit laggy, but anyways. So one of the things, while we wait, let me show you one more thing here. This is also another very useful page that you want to check when you're building your auto cache strategy. For example, let me see, we're looking at the UK site, right? So you're looking here pretty much at this UK English HTML. These numbers here that we're seeing are actually going to go up and up as, you know, whenever someone is accessing a new page and the caching is being, you know, filled with data, these numbers are going to keep going up and up until either we set a limit or until it reaches a hard red limit. So by default, Sitecore comes with 50 megabytes per site worth of HTML cache, right? So that means if you have 5 tenants, you get 250 megabytes out of the box. But 50 megabytes is not a lot. Like if you have a website with multiple pages with a lot of heavy, traffic, one of the things that you want to do when you're, in your loads, when you're performing load tests, is you want to check how much, like when you have like a realistic load traffic test, you want to test how much those numbers are going to go up, because they can go up really fast. Like we saw 300 megabytes, 400 megabytes per site, and we had 6 sites. So, it can use a lot of memory, right? So that's something that you need to account for. Finally, this page is open. Let me just refresh it and go back to the stats page. And refresh this. Hopefully, here we go. Look at what we have here. We have now things getting added to the cache. And again, I'm not gonna go into experience editor and show that all those renderings in the specific page, they don't have cache cinema on them. This is pretty much all the auto cache engine working under the hood and pretty much tagging whether it's cacheable or not and its variations. So this is why we're starting to see numbers going, showing up here. And maybe someone in the call is wondering, why are you not getting all of them from cache? Is because we have examples of in 3-column equal or here 2-column, all of them renderings that actually need to be excluded. So the exclude from cache is actually kicking in here, is actually causing some of them not to show from cache. So this is actually explains this number. And if I go back to this page and I just refresh it real quick and show the cache, okay, the numbers went up a little bit. I think they did. Sorry, I did not mark what the numbers that they were, but anyways, yeah, they did, right? Okay, so now here's a few things you need to consider when you're building something like this. First of all, as I said, hardware usage, right? So depending on the size of your site and depending on the load that you can get, if you don't set a limit, you're gonna get a lot of memory usage. And I mean, think about like a 16 or 32 gig memory server. Those numbers can go up really fast. And on a public website, you don't want to get, denying servers on your own website because you're limiting the hardware. So that's why load tests are so important in this case, because you want to see how much realistic hardware you actually need. And also, as I said, you have to actually tell what is the cache usage versus the cache size limit. So by default, as I said, it comes with 50 megabytes out of the box in the site configuration. If those numbers go up more than 50, what happens? Sitecore will clear some of the items in the cache and add new ones. So you reach a cache cap that you need to account for when you're building. That's why load tests are so important in this case, because then you can actually see how much of memory you need when you're configuring. So you need to account for that. Also, what's the size of the database cache that you want to set? Because I mean, if you limit on your web database X number of megabytes, then you're not going to benefit a lot from it as well. And as I said, just to reiterate, you want to think about this on a tenant level, because this enables you to pretty much vary, or maybe account for the most important websites. So for example, we had hot sites in one of our customers that they weren't really important, just a few people were accessing it. So auto cache for that site may not make much sense other than their homepage.com, their public facing website, that one that had a lot of traffic, their commerce, a lot of stuff. So it was more important in that case. And just to reiterate, you want to determine your memory cap when you're doing all of this work. Another thing that's really important is that there's a setting in Sitecore called caching.disable cache size limits. This is actually, you'll find this in the Sitecore scaling guide, where you want to either enable or disable it. If you enable it, if you set this one to true, so you're disabling limits. So this is why you're gonna see here that it has 8 gigs worth of memory. So it's gonna use all the hardware that it can get, right? So it can get pretty hungry, and we're not setting a limit for this. Now, if you don't wanna do that, if you wanna set a limit, all you have to do is pretty much set that this guy here, caching.disable cache size limit, to false, And then the configuration that is going to drive the cache behavior is pretty much what you set on your site definition. So when you're defining it, it's going to read that config. One other thing, just so you guys know, BrainDrop Core also actually has a built-in auto cache that supports donut caching. This cache strategy that I showed you guys here, this is more than like an opt-out. This is not donut, but it's actually not far from getting to donut cache. Donut cache, what the difference would be is, for example, opt-out is you have one column, or sorry, two column, with a banner and with a button on them, right? So if you opt out, it's gonna opt out the whole two column, right? But you can actually get an implemented donut cache, which is actually a step ahead of it, which is you just want to opt out just that rendering instead of the whole section that is getting rendered. I mean, for the sake of what we did here, this was more than enough. But if you want to take a step further, what I'm showing you guys here is actually not that far. You have to change a couple of processors. It can actually get that done. And BrainDrop Core actually has that and supports after version 3.04. And as I promised, here's the link with the implementation details. All of this code, source code, pretty much is there. It's not in GitHub, but if you follow this, you pretty much can implement it. All right, I'm done talking here. Are there any questions? That's pretty much what I wanted to show you.
Interesting, great presentation, Diego. I'm not sure if I was sleeping at that time or if you didn't talk about it, or if I was outside trying to open some snack. But is this part of Sitecore 9, or is this some customization, or is this a module? What is this?
This is custom code that we build. Sitecore does not support auto cache at all. Out of the box, I mean.
Are you going to provide that, the source code?
I mean, as I said, it's in the blog if you want to implement something about it, but we cannot share the code, the full code, and pretty much it. But I mean, if you follow that,
you can implement yourself.
Yeah, that's what we did.
Hey, Vinicius here. So you mentioned about hardware problems. Hi. Hardware problems. Memory could be very hungry, right? So is that some sort of recommendation to not using when you think about PaaS implementations?
I don't think so. Honestly, I don't see that in that sense. I think it's pretty much around your cache strategy, whether it's IaaS or PaaS. You want to limit, or you want to know how much of your website is going to consume. Of course, if that's why load tests are so important, right? That's why you want to have a lower environment where you can actually pretty much trigger traffic that emulates production traffic as closely as possible in the peaks, because then you start getting your metrics to know, okay, I need 1 gig worth of memory, I need 2 gigs, I need 5 gigs, based on your load, right? I mean, because the load is gonna drive your site. You're not gonna provide unlimited memory, but you know how many users visit your website, so you can pretty much through analytics, run those load tests and say, okay, I need this amount of hardware to actually run that. And I guess that doesn't vary in PaaS or IaaS. I mean, of course, if you need IaaS, you need to think about how many your VM has. If you need to create, more powerful VMs, but with PaaS, this is easier, right? You can upscale easier than with IaaS, but that's about it. Anyone else? Anyone on the line?
I remember when you showed the configuration. Looks like that is something you can set up by site, right?
Yep.
So you can go to the site, your site definitions, and of course apply even rule-based patching for multiple, the new things for Sitecore 9.
Yep.
But if you can show the configuration,
Here. So here, for example, this is
that's fine. It's not there. Okay, there you go. So here you are defining that for your site master, those are the idea of each rendering, right?
those. These are the actual keywords of the rendering inside core. So if I look into any of those inside core, I will actually go to the rendering
Yeah.
definition.
Sorry, because natively Sitecore can only have one cache definition per rendering.
Right?
Here you're doing like the same rendering having different cache settings for different sites, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, if you set on the rendering definition, then you're not supporting multi-tenancy at all. So and that's a problem because think about this. Then you're doing not an auto cache. You're forcing the cache on the rendering definition, so it cannot vary only by the variations that you set. For example, if it's vary by data, then every single instance of that rendering will vary by data, and no
No
matter
matter the
what.
website you are.
Exactly. So that's this gives you power to say, okay, for site master you want this, but the other side I want a completely different strategy. That's why you want to do something like this.
And here you are adding by ID, right? And then you have
Yep.
the same vary by these that you have in the UI, correct?
Exactly. These are all of site cores out of the box. Vary by data, vary by device, etc. Except vary by page. Vary by page is something that it was built in BrainDrox core, where it's very similar to vary by data, but instead of varying by the component, it varies by the page. So if you're on a different page, it creates a new
New
cache
cache.
key. So we already supported it in this implementation, but aside from that, it's pretty much out of the box.
And is so the only way to refer to your render is by ID, correct?
I think in this case it made more sense because I mean we're on the processors when we're executing, we're looking based on the ID of it, so we're using that, right? So for example, if you look at we're actually checking when for example, this is the set cacheable processor. We're checking based on the ID of the rendering that's getting executed, whether it exists on that list or not, and we're comparing based on IDs. If you use paths, it can, but I mean IDs um, work better in our implementation.
Perhaps you can have rules to set that in the future instead of just config file. Uh,
I'll explain you why we did this way. We were thinking about actually adding originally it to the database. So actually, you defining Sitecore. You how you can do it. And actually, that's how we did in BrainJox Core. But the caveat, as I said in my presentation, you have to be very careful when you're adding something like this. Because think about this: if you have 15 renderings on a page and you're actually calling the database, you're calling it 15 times for every single render. So it needs to be a very light, very tactical change. And at this moment, we thought, well, reading from a config is going to be less expensive, but it's been done like that, accessing the database, but that's been done in BrainDrux core. But yeah,
I would like to actually. Edipo has one question here that I will reserve to after this, so I can shut my
okay,
mouth off. Um I have
finally.
one question about cache, which is more generically speaking about cache. Uh, I see in my experiences that setting up enabling cache is something trivial. Selecting the right strategy is the hard part.
You're right, but at the same time, it comes down to your workflow. And workflow, I mean, not the core workflow, like the flow of the project, who is working, and what's the skill set. So, an AutoCache implementation like this, we fix a very big problem, which is we had a design that was supposed to support more than 1,000 different pages, and we cannot have templates for every single of them. We cannot rely on standard values at all. So, and also on the other hand, we had content authors that their skill set was not focused on technical. Really, the skill set is creating content, is delivering content, right? So, but you're asking your content authors to dictate, oh, this is cache vary by data. You're actually, you know, most of them don't have like the expertise or the knowledge to understand what does that impact in the system, and they shouldn't be doing that. That's more like a developer type of deal. So this is why it's a gap in any framework that has follows atomic design, SXA, Braindox Core, any of those that actually that you want to empower your content authors, but you also want to benefit from Sitecore out of the box cache features. So this is why auto cache we implemented like this, because then our content authors didn't have to worry about any of this. They just knew that they're gonna build their pages. They know how to build their pages, and it would work. It would perform well. They wouldn't have to worry about any of that part, which really, again, they shouldn't. This is more like a technical thing, and it needs to be addressed by a technical person.
Great, great. Good thing. So that's a good idea. Actually, setting up cache is not something your content editor would do. It's more a developer task, right? Which by definition will be the person who knows if that component gets data from an external API, then
Yep.
it cannot be cached at all, or define the strategy. Yeah.
That's exactly why we thought that it should be worked like that.
So Edipo was asking how complicated it is to configure cache using dispatches. I mean, I guess you can tell us about the challenges you find by having this, or the
Well, the first
advantage.
well the first part is this cache settings here. Really, this is more like the strategy of the ranges that you want to cache, how you want to handle all of that. If you want to disable cache size limit as I showed you or not. But the patching itself, we're just patching the processors into the MVC rendering pipeline. So the challenge there is you need to understand this moment. Thank you. Um, you need to understand when are you patching them, in which moment, in which part of the pipeline, because it has, like, I don't know, 10 processors. So you need to understand exactly at which processor you want to patch in. So set cacheability precedes set cacheable renderers, for example. So you need to actually understand a little bit the MVC rendering pipeline to say, oh, okay, um, in this processor execution, it's already been set as cacheable. So now it's going to generate the cache key. So now it's going to render for cache. So there's an order there. So the challenge really is you need to understand that order, what it's doing, and when you're going to hook into each and one of these processors. But really, that's a matter of you opening your show config, seeing, getting that pipeline, getting the processors, decompiling, see, oh, it's doing this. Okay, I need to, as I said, I need to patch to hook into that pipeline to add it to be cacheable and its variations. So when I did that, when I implemented this, we needed to know, say, okay, when are we going to execute it? Of course, it needs to be before you generate a cache key and before you render from cache, because you're setting the cache. So, it's in the beginning of the pipeline. So you have to understand the pipeline to know exactly when to patch it. But I guess you have to learn it. Does that
Yes,
answer the
yeah,
question?
I guess so. Edipo is also commenting that you need to have a huge strategy to configure auto cache, or you can put your server down. Actually, cache is there to help you save resources, not the opposite. In what situations a cache, a wrongly set up cache, will damage your server, your resources?
That's actually a very good question, because you said it right. Cache is supposed to save you resources, like to, but not add more. But when you're adding auto cache, you don't have control. You don't have that level of control in terms of will it use 100 megabytes or 200 megabytes. Actually, you can set that control, but then you're setting the limit to how much you want to cache. So again, this is why this comes down to cache strategy. You have to think about it. You have to test that implementation and say, okay, if I run a load test that my peak users in my production in the week is Monday 3 p.m. and that is like 200 or I don't know 1,000 users at the same time. So you need to account for that because if that's your peak, maybe you want to add like a buffer of 50% more and say that this consumes you 200 megabytes. Maybe you want to save 300 megabytes worth of memory because when you set inside core the cache the HTML cache size, you're actually already allocating that memory. So you're saying if you have 5 sites, which is our case here, so 300 megabytes, that's 1.5 gigs of memory usage of that server that you're allocating for those sites to add Sitecore to add the cache. So of course, if it goes more than that, Sitecore will start to clear after it hits the cap of 300 megabytes per site. Now, to your question, Rodrigo, when can that bring down? I would say bring down the server is if you don't have a good strategy, if you don't load your test site, if you don't load test your site, and you don't know well what are the caps or where you're gonna draw the limit, if you're gonna let it run, without any limit, you find yourself in a situation where all the memory can be used. But again, it's part of the strategy. You have to think about this when implementing something like this. You cannot just leave it, until you find yourself with a website down because you didn't limit that. So you have to think about it.
So I guess if you get one ticket in your board telling, please enable cache in the website, what would you respond?
Well, I would say first of all, this needs to be thinking when you're implementing, right? I don't think you need to in a live site. If you want to add this, you can, but I mean, this is more like I would say when you're building, you need to think about that because that's a very, as I said, this is a big feature. This messes with a very sensitive pipeline inside core. So again, you need to have someone senior thinking about how you're going to do it and where you're going to change it. To give you one example, if I change this line of code here, this is log.debug. So that means that only when we're running on debug mode, it's going to add a log. But if I change this to log.info, this is going to flood Sitecore's logs. Absolutely, because this is going to run every single time every single render is executed. So again, 1,000 pages, everyone with 10 renderings. So that's 10,000 times this will get executed every single time. So you can see your logs going up and up and up. And that's going to consume a lot of your memory just because you didn't think about, oh, I'm doing something wrong here. But of course, you just want to debug if you really want to. But I just added this, for the sake of if you need to debug something. But this is to give you one example as to when you're changing, you need to account for these kind of things. That's why you need to implement and test it really well because, I mean, otherwise you find yourself into this situation.
Okay, so there's not a chance to have one ticket telling to turn on in the whole website, right?
Well, this is already live in my website and it's running really well. So
All right, I understand.
I'm happy with it.
Thinking about that during the implementation, but suppose you have one website that has zero cache and they want like a rescue mission to enable cache. How would you approach that? Would you turn on everywhere and disable where necessary, or would you cherry pick something?
I don't think this is a right answer to that. I think it really comes down to a lot of aspects of it. One is, are they? How much harder do they have? How much are they willing to invest in something like this? Because this costs time. You need to implement. You need to test. So, I mean, do they have budget for that? Do they want something like this? Do they have an actual need? How many content authors do they have? How many pages are they building? Are they just maintaining their website, or are they creating like a new design or rebrand of the website that is actually so? I guess all of these actually add to this variable. If I had, we implemented this because we saw the need for our clients where they had the design had so many variations and they had so many aspects of it that if we didn't have it, the website would not go up. It would not go live at all because again, we cannot rely on standard values. So we had to come up with something like this to deliver a solution like this. And again, I see the benefit of it for many other websites that they don't have cache because either the vendor that implemented, they put someone that doesn't know much about Sitecore, they don't know the benefits of Sitecore cache. There are websites in Sitecore out there that don't benefit from Sitecore cache at all. I've seen that. So that to me shows me that the people that build, they don't know very well what they're doing or how they're building. So that seniority, in thinking about this, the impact that it has, the metrics for the website, to respond faster, how much it's going to consume, all comes down to that, right? So I don't think there's a right answer. I think there are multiple aspects that actually vary there. So
All right, yeah. Good stuff, Diego. Wise words here. Anything else? Okay, guys. So cache, use cache with responsibility.